right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And I want to say a huge thank you to all our teachers joining us from across North America and around the world. It has been such a thrill having you. I know it's a very unusual time to be a teacher, but we really appreciate you joining us live and on YouTube as we continue to highlight and celebrate such amazing people and organizations around the globe. So today is particularly exciting for me. Last spring, we partnered for the first time with the Friends of the Rouge Watershed. In the east end of Toronto exists one of the coolest natural urban parks in the world. So I'm not going to steal all the thunder and let our team explain a little bit about that. But we did a series of programs in the spring and summer that were really, really exciting, really well received. And today we're diving in with the winter. Here in Toronto, it's getting pretty chilly out there. So we're going to learn a little bit about winter migrations, how animals survive the winter, where they go, how they get there, and more. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Tivia and Jim at the Friends of the Rouge Watershed, and take us away.
Bye.
Huh?
Welcome and thank you for joining us. It's Tivia and I am the Environmental Project Coordinator with Friends of the Rouge Watershed. And I'm joined today by Jim Robb, our part-time General Manager at Friends of the Rouge Watershed. And I just want to let everyone know we are going to have our masks on, but we will have to take them off while we're talking, but we will maintain our social distancing. So Friends of the Rouge Watershed is a small environmental charitable organization that's based in the Rouge River Watershed, a national park right here near Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today we are situated right by a beautiful Rouge River Valley, right in the Rouge National Park. So just to give you a little bit of a background about Friends of the Rouge Watershed. Friends of the Rouge Watershed, as I mentioned, or FRW for short, is a charitable group which works to promote a scientific and community stewardship approach to environmental protection, planning, restoration, and monitoring. And we proudly serve the diverse communities of the Eastern GTA, or the Greater Toronto Area. We involve thousands of youth and community volunteers in tangible actions to improve watershed, ecosystem, and human health. And we have approximately 2,000 subscribers to our newsletter, including hundreds of teachers. And since 1991, Friends of the Rouge Watershed has partnered with hundreds of teachers in schools and many government partners to create the Rouge Park Watershed and Greenbelt plans. We also educate and empower over 65,000 youth and community volunteers, and we've also planted and maintained over 730,000 native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers. And we restored over 3.4 million square meters of native forests and wetlands. And these restored forests, wetlands, and meadows have increased habitat size, quality, and connectivity to sustain biological diversity and help the recovery of species at risk. They also help to absorb more water, carbon, and pollutants to reduce the costly impacts of climate change, flooding, and erosion. And they also produce the oxygen that we all need to survive and the clean air and water that we need to stay healthy. And Jesse has put up some pictures, some really cool transformation pictures. The first one there is what used to be an old landfill, the Beare landfill, that in just about 7 years was completely transformed into a beautiful municipal park. And in the next transformation photo, we have what used to be an old barren gravel pit that in just a couple years was transformed into a beautiful biodiverse wetland, which is now habitat to several species at risk. So before we get started, I would like to just read a land acknowledgement to show respect for the Indigenous peoples who lived on and took care of this land for thousands of years. So we respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered upon the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. And just before we jump into our animal slides, we do have a map of the Rouge National Park that we can pull up. And thanks to decades of actions by many volunteers that were dedicated to saving the Rouge, the Ontario government has created a 40 square kilometer Rouge Park, which was created between 1990 and 2010. And this park was enlarged into a 79 square kilometer Rouge National Park by the Canadian federal government in 2015. And the Rouge National Park is part of Canada's endangered Carolinian Forest Zone, which is a southern Ontario life zone, which is home to 25% of Canada's endangered species and more than 1,700 native plants and animals, including more than 30 species at risk, are found in the Rouge National Park today. And although it is located next to Canada's largest urban area, Rouge National Park is one of the most biological diverse parks in all of Canada. And the restoration of natural areas on the public lands in Rouge National Park is necessary because less than 1% of Canada's Carolinian Forest Zone has been protected within existing provincial and national parks. And this is far less than required to sustain biodiversity and water quality, combat climate change, and assist in the recovery of endangered species. So now we'll move into our animal slides. So the first animal that we have is a black bear. And when I think of hibernation, one of the first animals that comes to my mind is a black bear. And so hibernation is when animals rest or remain asleep during the entire winter to conserve energy. And animals do this in order to survive harsh weather conditions or if there's a lack of food. And when bears hibernate, their body temperatures drop from 38 degrees Celsius to 33 degrees Celsius, and their heart rate goes from 50 beats a minute to just 10. And they don't eat, they don't drink, and they don't even use the bathroom. So hibernating bears, as a result of this, lose half of their body fat, but amazingly, they don't lose any muscle mass or much calcium from their bones either. So next up, we have a flying squirrel.
Hi guys, it's Jim Robb from Friends of the Rouge. We have northern flying squirrels in the Rouge and they're really cool. They don't actually fly, but they can glide pretty much probably like a football field long distance between trees. Flying squirrels need friends to survive the winter. They don't fully hibernate, but what they do is they need several friends to gather together at night in a little den in a hollow part of a tree, and they keep each other warm. When you're not very big, it's easy to get really cold. So they have several friends, and usually in the summer and spring, they're territorial because they want to protect all the nuts and things they eat on the ground from other squirrels, and they want to protect areas to mate. But in the fall, their hormone levels change and they get more friendly, and they spend the winter cuddled up in a hole in a tree with several friends. And they don't fully hibernate. They go out and eat things and that and still do a little bit of activity. But that shows you why it's good to have friends.
All right, next we have a groundhog. And groundhogs are true hibernators. And many of you may be familiar with groundhogs, especially the most famous one that we have here in Ontario, which is Mr. Wyerton Willie, who comes out every February for Groundhog Day to see whether or not he can see a shadow to predict if we'll have an early spring or a late winter. And so groundhogs enter hibernation in either late September or October, and they don't usually emerge until March. And while hibernating, groundhogs can actually reduce their heartbeat as well from approximately 80 beats a minute to just 5 beats per minute. And they can also reduce their temperature, their body temperature, to as low as 3 degrees Celsius. Next up, we have a beaver.
Now, beaver is an iconic Canadian symbol, and they stay awake all winter, but beaver prepare for winter. You'll see them in the fall working long hours between dusk and sunrise. They're kind of nocturnal animals. And what they do is they chop down willow and poplar trees, and they drag the limbs into the pond and anchor them at the bottom of the pond near a big sort of wooden mud igloo they build called the Beaver Lodge. And in the winter, they have a hole that goes out the bottom of their lodge, and they can go directly into the water and under the ice, and they'll drag sticks of poplar and willow that they've stored up into their lodge, and they'll nibble on it. So beavers are smart. They prepare for winter. They stay awake in winter. If they run out of sticks, they also eat things like the big, huge roots of lily pads. Underneath those beautiful white and circular leafed lilies, down at the bottom, there are these long root-like structures that are full of sugar and nutrients. So the beavers also eat those in the winter. So they don't go asleep. They're very industrious. They prepare for winter.
So next up is a meadow vole.
Sorry, the next one is the meadow vole.
Yep.
Now, meadow voles are they're sort of like about the size of a hamster, little beady eyes. They are what hawks and owls and foxes eat a lot of. Interesting thing about meadow voles, they are very territorial all through the spring and the summer. And they defend their territories, and sort of anybody who comes in their territory, they'll give them a little nip. But in the fall, in October, when the day lengths get less than 11 hours, their hormone levels change and their aggressiveness drops, and they too become friendly like the squirrels. And they also form communal nests where they'll have a little group of grass, and several of them will huddle together to keep warm. They stay awake in the winter. They don't hibernate. They will go out and feed on little fallen seeds and the roots of plants and any little thing that might still be green. But that's how meadow voles get through the winter.
Next up is a red-winged blackbird.
So many birds migrate to survive the winter. So they go further south where the rivers and lakes don't freeze and where there's more food to eat. Red-winged blackbirds are one of those. But there's an interesting story with them, is that the males, they come back probably about the second or third week of March. The females don't come back from down south till about the first or second week of April. Why the difference? Well, the male birds, they don't have to lay eggs, so they come back early. They set up their territories, they start singing, they try to defend their territories from other males. Meanwhile, the females are staying further south so they can eat enough food, so they're really healthy and fat, and so that they can have all the energy needed to lay the eggs. So the males come back early, the females a little bit later, and that's how the red-winged blackbird does it. The next one's the snowy owl. So snowy owls live way up in the Arctic, and you probably know that most owls hunt at night. But in the Arctic during the summer, there isn't much night. It's daylight 20 hours a day or more. So snowy owls have adapted to hunting in the day. Now, most of the time, they're way up north. But some years, the food of the snowy owl, called a lemming, which is, again, kind of like a big hamster or a little guinea pig, the numbers of the lemmings crash, and then the owls are kind of hungry. So sometimes they come way farther south. And this year, there's not a huge number, but they're around, and they're all around sort of the Lake Ontario. They come down and go in rural areas, and you'll see them actually come right down to the ground hunting for those little meadow voles that we just talked about.
All right. Next up are the very cool gray tree frog and wood frog. So how do these guys survive the winter? So in the winter, eastern gray tree frogs usually bury themselves beneath logs, leaves, and dirt. And about 40% of their whole body can freeze during the winter, as you can see in those pictures. And they keep their bloodstream from freezing by producing a special antifreeze like liquid that's called glycerol. And so the rest of their body fluids usually become frozen during hibernation. And wood frogs are pretty similar. In the winter, wood frogs are creatures that can be described as the living dead. Yet every spring, somehow they come right back to life again. So as winter comes, these wood frogs hunker down just underneath the leaf litter, and they begin to produce a special antifreeze in their blood. And this is made out of glucose and glycogen. And as the temperatures continue to drop, this antifreeze is taken up into all of their cells. And inside each of these cells, this sugary syrup makes sure that the cells stay strong, and it also prevents little ice crystals from forming in their cells because these would harm them really badly. So when these frogs are in their frogsicle state, their hearts actually stop beating, and they also stop breathing. And as much as 70% of the frog's body is frozen completely solid. But these hardy wood frogs can survive all winter in this sort of suspended animation. undergoing several cycles of freezing and thawing as the temperatures rise and fall. And when the weather warms, these frogs can actually thaw out, sometimes in as little as a day, and emerge their chorus, which essentially signals the start of our Canadian spring. And one interesting fact about these frogs is that scientists are actually learning more and more about how the wood frog and the gray tree frog can tolerate winter in hopes of one day improving organ transplants for humans. Yeah.
If I can just jump in and say, also, the wood frogs too, being able to go into suspended animation, they're almost like zombies. If we're going to have space travel, or maybe for people who are sick, and then we might discover a cure later, scientists are trying to find a way that people could maybe be put into a cold storage for a while and then brought back out. Because if you're going to travel to another star or planet, it might take a long time, or if you have a disease that you might cure in the future. So tree frogs have already, and wood frogs have already found a way to become like zombies. There's no heartbeat, no brain waves, and some, through the miracle of nature and the creative force of the universe, they wake back up in the springtime and become full of life again. It's pretty cool.
All right, next up we have our snapping turtle. So some species of animals that have got hibernation down pat are reptiles and amphibians. And we just mentioned some amphibians, and this makes sense as these are some of the oldest surviving animals on the planet, and they've had millions and millions of years to adapt and evolve to these conditions. And so these cold-blooded animals, also known as ectothermic animals, cannot produce their own body heat using their metabolism, and so they rely on the sunlight and warm rocks to keep them warm. And in the winter, it's much too cold for them to be active. And so in order for them to survive this difficult season, they enter hibernation. And so when they do this, turtles, just like frogs, are able to slow down their metabolism to where their heart beats so slow that you can barely even detect it. And their temperatures drop so low so that they use very little energy. And turtles actually spend the winter dug into the mud at the bottom of ponds or streams. And you might actually be wondering how these animals are able to breathe when they're underwater for so long, sometimes months and months at a time. Well, interestingly enough, snapping turtles like the one in this picture are actually able to absorb oxygen through the water using the skin on their throat. And the Blandings turtle in the next slide there, with their very beautiful bright yellow necks, are also able to breathe using the skin on their body. And Blanding turtles are known to be some of the very first turtles to come out of hibernation, as they are very cold tolerant. So next up we have the Monarch Butterfly.
Hi guys, when I was about 9 years old, I caught a butterfly, a monarch butterfly, with a little white tag on it. And it had the phone number at the University of Toronto. And my mom called it for me. And it was Dr. Urquhart, who was a professor there. And he was studying monarchs. This is way back in the 60s, early 60s. And he was tagging them with a little white tag. And they would then fly, and someone else would catch them and call him. And he'd draw a line between the point where it was released and where it was captured. And that's called a vector. And gradually, people were trying to figure out where they go to migrate. And after many years of studying, Dr. Urquhart found that monarch butterflies go all the way down to the mountains of Mexico, and up at about 3,000 meters in the mountains of Mexico, they gather on these fir trees and they go to sleep and hibernate. The temperature there is about 0 to about 10, 15 degrees, but they hibernate for the whole winter. Then those butterflies that came from further north and went all the way to the south start their way back north. But the ones on the way back north, they never go all the way. They sort of have babies in Texas or Oklahoma or somewhere, and then those babies fly a little bit once they develop into butterflies up further. And then finally, after the third generation, they get back to their northern areas of the United States and Canada. It's a pretty spectacular thing. And scientists have been asking, well, how do they know? How can they navigate? How can they get from one place all the way up north down to the same mountains and the same trees when they've never gone the full distance? And what scientists have found is they have this ability to know where the sun is and what the time of day is, and therefore they can locate where south and north is. And we still haven't been able to find all the stuff, but it's almost like they have a little internal compass, and that they can use it to find their way. And they're one of the few butterflies that does this, but they go all the way down thousands of miles, migrating north in the springtime to come back up north, and then south in the fall in September. The monarch butterfly.
The green darner.
Oh, the green darner. The green darner, over just in the last 15, 20 years, they found that they also migrate. And the really interesting thing is, it was citizen scientists who were kind of giving university researchers information that helped them define that. They were able to analyze different chemicals in the bodies of the dragonflies, and they could tell where they were living most of their life. And they found that there were dragonflies in Florida and southern United States, Alabama, that most of their life they spent in southern Ontario or in New York State. And we now know that they do migrate all the way down south, and then 2 or 3 generations will occur as they migrate back up in the spring. And it's pretty spectacular for this little sort of cellophane-like wings that can fly all that distance, the green darner dragonfly.
Next one is the Gypsy Moth.
So the last one I think is the Gypsy Moth. Now this is an insect or a moth that was introduced to North America from Europe many years ago, and it's actually a bit of a problem. It eats almost anything. Most moths and butterflies specialize on a few trees, but the Gypsy Moth can eat pine trees, spruce trees, maple trees, oak trees. It just eats anything. And next year I think they're going to be really bad, because if you look at that little brown spot on the slide, that's an egg mass, and they're all over the trees right now. So what most butterflies and moths do is their young survive the winter in egg form or in a pupa. I think in that slide you might also be able to see the pupa, which is moths and butterflies go through metamorphosis, this magical thing where they start out as a little egg, then they become a caterpillar, then they go into a pupa or a chrysalis, and in there all their body parts change into a beautiful butterfly which emerges. But I gave you the Gypsy Moth because one of the things that controls their populations is cold. So if we have 4 or 5 days below -30, then the eggs don't survive well. And what's happening with climate change is things like the Gypsy Moth here and out west, the mountain pine beetle, it's no longer cold enough to kill off the eggs. And so their populations are exploding, and they're causing a lot of damage to forests. So that's how climate change and biodiversity, they all interact.
All right, so those are all the animal slides that we have for you guys. I just have a little bit of a wrap up of what you guys can do to reduce climate change and increase biodiversity and protect the environment. So to combat our global climate change and biodiversity crisis, the United Nations has declared the year 2021 to 2030 as the decade of ecological restoration, in which we must focus on planting billions and billions of trees. So Environment Canada recommends that a watershed should have more than 60% forest and wetland cover to protect the native biodiversity and water quality. And unfortunately, the Rouge National Park only has 38% forest and wetland cover, which is far below the minimum amount that is required to combat climate change and flooding and improve biodiversity and water quality. So if the federal government and Parks Canada works with youth and community groups like 10,000 Trees, together we can implement plans for increasing forest and wetland cover to reach 60% in the Rouge National Park over the next 2 decades. So given the serious challenges that we face regionally and globally, Rouge National Park should be a visible example of forest and wetland restoration in order to provide a healthier future for our ecosystems, our planet, and our children. So here are a couple things that you can do to reduce climate change, increase biodiversity, and protect the environment. So firstly, you can plant a native tree or grow native wildflowers or native shrubs in your garden at home. Secondly, you can practice the 3 R's, which are reduce, reuse, and recycle. And some ways that you can do this are, for example, using a refillable water bottle rather than a plastic water bottle, and reducing your single plastic use. So when you're going grocery shopping, you can use a reusable shopping bag, and when you're at school, you can use a reusable lunch bag as well. And lastly, you can visit our website, the Rouge National Park Friends website, to learn what else you can do to protect the environment. So now I guess we can move into our question and answer period if you guys have any questions for us.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for such a neat talk, guys. I particularly love the wood frogs. It just blows my mind that animals can survive being encased, entombed in this ice over the whole winter. So thank you so much for sharing such a diversity of strategies animals use to survive those cold winter months that are here and coming more so very soon. We have over 144 people in groups joining on YouTube, which is crazy. So we are at like 400 kids across North America today. Welcome into all of you, wherever you might be joining from. And let's dive in with questions, guys. I'm going to start with Mr. Dunn's class. They're joining us in Sudbury, Ontario. Mr. Dunn, if you want to come on in, go for it.
All right. Thank you very much. We were just wondering, as a group, has the park lost any animals that they once had and flourished there? Or were you able to maintain the biodiversity that has existed for so many years there?
Yeah, the current fragmentation, which means most of the habitat that's left is in little tiny parcels that are separated by roads and development. So Environment Canada did this study called How Much Habitat is Enough? They've done 3 reports of it, and they said for a watershed to keep biodiversity, you essentially need about 60% of that watershed to be in forests and wetlands and meadows. And the Rouge Watershed itself is only at about 14%, and the park is at 38%. So biodiversity is gradually being lost from the park. We used to have a lot more rare species. We used to have things like loggerhead shrikes, and they're gone. But there are some good news signs. There's been about 3.5 square kilometers of restoration by just Friends of the Rouge itself, and many other groups like 10,000 Trees have done work. So this is a really good example of the recovery. If we can put back the native forests and wetlands that are down in the existing watershed and Ontario Rouge Park plans, if Parks Canada really respects and implements those plans, we will see more and more rare species come back to this area.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. All right, we're going to go to Ms. Gerdari's class. They're joining us in Brampton. If you guys want to just demute your microphone, you'll be good to go. And then we'll head to the U.S. in a minute. So Ms. Gerdari, if you're there, hopefully.
Yes. Okay. So I just unmute. So this question is concerning the gypsy moth. Is there any other thing that we can do if because of climate change, there is much more of the gypsy moth hatching?
Yeah.
Well, one thing you can do around your house or your park, the egg masses are fairly easy to see. They're kind of like a little brownish, woolly kind of thing, about the size of a toonie or a dollar. You can rub them off in the winter, squash them a little bit. Some of them will still live, but if you knock them off the tree and squash them, that helps. There is, in some areas where they get really bad, they spray something called bacteria thuringiensis. And it's actually, I believe it's a virus that when the larva, the caterpillars are sort of big and brown, they have yellow stripes or black yellow stripes with sort of red little bumps on them. When the caterpillars are a certain size, if they eat that virus on the leaves after it's been sprayed, it hurts their intestines and they gradually die. But I think right now it also may kill other butterflies and moths larvae if they're in the same stage. So you have to be careful about that.
Very cool, guys. I'm so glad we got that question. So thanks, Ms. Gerdari. All right, let's go to Ms. Salinas' class. They're joining us in San Antonio, Texas. I think over our time here, we've had every class in San Antonio join in. Always nice to have Texas groups. Come on in, guys. Go for it. Hey, Ms. Salinas, take your time.
Hi there. How are y'all?
Good. How are you?
We're doing well here. Am I off mute?
You're off mute.
Okay. Just making sure. So I went to our classrooms just to kind of get an idea if any kiddos had questions. And one of the things that one of our science guys is really interested in is how big do the snapping turtles get?
Well, they live a long time. I mean, they can live for close to 100 years. And so their problem right now is that there's so many roads in our developed areas that a lot of them get killed before they reach that age. But I've seen ones myself that are, in Canada, we'd say 50, 60 centimeters. I think you'd probably say 2 feet in diameter. In like places like Algonquin Park and that, where there's not as much mortality from traffic. So they can get to be about 2 feet in size, and they have a very long neck and a very sharp mouth, or it's like a parrot's beak. And you have to be really careful. I've rescued them from roads. Sometimes if they're crossing a road and it's not too busy, you stop and you have to be very careful because they can inflict a bad bite. If you pick them up right at the back of the shell, you can lift them, but I wouldn't recommend it for young people because they have a very, very sharp claws, which they will claw you with, and they have a very dangerous bite.
If you see a snapping turtle ever in your life, it's not an animal that you readily want to go and pick up. They look very hardy. They're like a dinosaur. They're very, very cool. All right, great question, guys. Let's go to Miss Woodley's class in Brantford, and then we'll take a few questions from YouTube from all our groups there. Miss Woodley, come on in.
Hi guys, thank you so much. This has been so interesting. Our class, our grade 3s, were talking a lot about different animals that hibernate or migrate. And we were wondering about bees. My friend Kendra in my class was wondering, do bees hibernate or migrate over the cold?
Well, bees, I believe, I'm not a bee expert, but I believe bees stay in the hive. And I believe they have special bees that actually try and keep, there's quite a few of them in there. And I think some of them try and keep the air circulating in that, but I'm not an expert on bees. I do know that bees are suffering a lot from agricultural chemicals. There's so many things out there. There's these neonicotinoid chemicals that are sort of like, it's like giving the bee too much coffee, and they get so up that they can't find their way back to the hive, or they forget how to pick up nectar. But there are also mites now and different diseases that are attacking bees. Now, the honeybee actually isn't native. It was introduced from Asia into Europe and then over to here. But it's so wonderful. About 40-50%, I think, of the food we eat is thanks to the pollinating effect of the honeybees. But I believe they sort of they quiet down a bit, but I think they're not hibernating over the winter. But you'd have to look online to check on that, or check with a scientist.
Yeah. So to follow that up, I've been looking this up while you've been chatting about it, and we've covered pollinators in a few of our programs in the past. So bees do gather together, and they keep warm sort of through clustering, just like those flying squirrels gathering with their friends. A whole colony of bees will gather, keep themselves warm enough to last through the winter. Also inside the hive, it's a much different environment than it would be out in the wind on the outside of a tree, say. So great question, guys. All right, I want to take a question from Miss McLaren's class on YouTube. They're joining us in Nepean, Ontario. What's the job called where you help transform landscapes, and what sort of education would you need to help, build up those areas? At the beginning of your talk, you showed all these great restoration in action. Could you explain how you end up with a role like that and what you need to get there?
So both Tivy and I can maybe add to this. My background is ecology and forest ecology at the University of Toronto. There are programs now that teach people ecological restoration. And so Tivy, you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my background is in environmental studies and ecosystem management, and just through a lot of volunteering and working with different organizations that offer ecological restoration opportunities, like planting trees, native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers in your area, you can definitely get some experience doing that as well.
Yeah. Fantastic, guys. All right, I'm going to go back for a few live questions, and then we'll take some more from YouTube. So, Mr. Dunn, if you have another one for us, come on in.
Yeah, you talked about global warming. And I was just wondering if there was any non-resident or introduced species there that pose like a serious risk to the park, whether it's plant or animal life.
Yeah.
Well, we can already see in Southern Ontario about 15 or 20 years ago, the West Nile virus came about, and it hit human beings and caused problem with human beings, but it also hit animals. And one I know for sure is that crows and blue jays, we were finding dead crows and blue jays around the park. And it's interesting, the animals seem to adapt to where they stopped nesting in the Rouge for a few years and we're further north. And it seems to be less so now, but climate change will allow southern diseases to move north, and that'll have significant repercussions for human beings and animals. It also, the wood frog, each time the wood frog sort of comes out of hibernation when it warms up, it's an energy cost. It has to use a lot of energy to wake up and then go back to sleep. So if climate change is causing these huge swings where, you know, we get 10 degrees Celsius for 4 or 5 days and then we go down to minus 10 for 4 or 5, that will have much more stress on animals during winter. We can see that in bats right now too. Bats are hibernators too, but they wake up every 2 or 3 weeks usually to go to the washroom, maybe have a little drink, and they're getting most of our bats in southern Ontario now, a lot of them are classed as endangered species because they're getting something called white nose fungal disease. And it's possible that it's the stress that's going on from waking up too often and going back to sleep. We don't know, but something's happening that's made that white nose fungus disease much more problem.
Yeah. There are a lot of threats facing Ontario wildlife. In terms of invasive species, I'd encourage you to look up some of those again online. Ontario, Toronto Provincial Parks all highlight some of these resources and some of the information about it online. So I'm going to try and link to that when we're done as well. There's some great resources out there. Yeah, invasive species. I'm glad we got a chance to touch upon that. So thank you, Mr. Dunn. I want to take one from Ms. Dykstra, who has, I think, joined us for every program all year long so far in 2021. She's joining us in Guelph. Approximately how many flying squirrels are there in the Rouge Watershed? So not specifically, but are flying squirrels common? Are they something that anyone could go and find? Because I'd love to see a flying squirrel, personally.
Well, so flying squirrels are nocturnal, so you're not likely to see them as much. There are 2 species of flying squirrel in southern Ontario, the northern flying squirrel and the southern. The Rouge, we don't think it has the southern variety. If you went down to Niagara or down to Point Pelee, they might have the southern and the northern. They're not really as common and you don't see them. When I saw them, it was because I was with a researcher and he knew their denning sites, and he went during the day and tapped on the tree, and it was so cute. This little squirrel with they have these big eyes, and he came out of the hole, stuck his head out, and he was like rubbing his head as though he's saying, "Hey, I'm trying to sleep here, guys, leave me alone." And they're very cute. But you don't see them very often because they're nocturnal. I don't know how big their territories are, but one of the things happens if their population goes down low, without their friends, they'll freeze in the winter. So there needs to be enough of them that 7 to 20 of them can get together in a den in a tree and actually last the winter.
Fantastic, guys. All right, let's go to Ms. Gerdari's class. If you guys have another one for us, come on in.
Actually, we have 2. So okay. We are lucky that we are in southern Ontario. So if we want to participate in the tree planting to help with this Rouge Watershed, how can we go about doing that? And the other one was, are there any guided tours for students? I mean, I know we are in COVID times, but hopefully things get better for students to visit that watershed and be able to see some of those fantastic animals that you have been showing us.
Great questions.
Yeah, for sure. So in the spring and fall, that's when we do our planting. So we have our spring planting season and our fall planting season. We're hoping that restrictions might get a little better for COVID-19, that we're able to have small groups of students and volunteers help us with those plantings and following all health and safety COVID guidelines. So we do invite a lot of schools and classes out for those plantings, so you can definitely reach out to us. We have our emails at the bottom, at the last slide of that presentation. You can also visit our website at frw.ca for our contact information as well, and you can sign up to actually volunteer with us as well. So that's one way that you can go about that. And we do offer educational hikes and interpretive hikes through various restoration sites that FRW has restored over the years. So that's something we like to do in the morning. We like to do some tree planting, and then in the afternoon we like to take the students out to the restoration sites and give them a nice educational hike as well.
Fantastic. So this applies to a lot of the groups that are in Southern Ontario and can actually make it to the Rouge Watershed. For our groups in Texas and around the world, look for local nature organizations, whether it's Friends of Parks, whether it's the parks themselves. There's often programs like this where you can actually get involved, go on hikes, do tree planting, all sorts of amazing activities. Again, all safely, and hopefully the world's open up in a way that we can all do that soon. But I encourage you guys to check that out. All right, we're going to take 3 more questions. I'm going to go to Miss Salinas' class back in Texas. Come on in, guys, and go for it. Hey, Miss Salinas.
Hi there. So one of our students is asking, what do the monarchs do to repopulate?
Okay, well, monarch populations have gotten very low in the last little while. There's a few things that do it. One is agricultural pesticides really hurt them. There's so much GMO corn and soybeans grown now that there isn't much room for the plant that they need. Monarchs need milkweed for their caterpillars to eat. Their caterpillars are white, green, and black striped, and they need that milkweed plant, and agricultural pesticides are sort of hurting that. What the monarchs do to repopulate is, or what we need to do, if we have more areas with milkweed, monarchs will recover and come back. One of the other things that's happening with monarchs is they fly to fairly small areas in the mountains in Mexico, and there's a lot of pressure in cutting down the fir trees that they land on and hibernate. So that's been another thing. Also, climate change has hurt them. There's been some bad storms and freezing rainstorms and that late in the season sometimes that has hurt their migration back up north. But if we give them habitat, milkweed plants, and if we reduce the pressures for cutting trees down where they hibernate in the winter, monarchs will be resilient and they will come back and their populations will increase. When I was young, I remember the forest near Lake Ontario in Toronto would just some years in the fall, they'd just turn orange even before the leaves turned orange. The forest would be orange from tens of thousands of butterflies. And I haven't seen that in 30 or 40 years, unfortunately.
I'm really glad we got a chance to talk about monarchs. And if you guys are keen, Alana Wilcox, and just type in monarch on our YouTube channel. We've done 2 really fantastic monarch presentations before, highlighting their entire migratory route and some of the threats facing them and what you guys can do to help. So I encourage you to check that out. All right, Ms. Woodley, I'm coming to you in just a second, but I want to go to St. Martin of Tours joining us at Stony Creek. They've got a great question in that you guys mentioned frogs, you mentioned big turtles, you mentioned Blanding's turtles. What happens to snakes? Where do they go in the winter?
Well, in their northern area, snakes go into what they call a hibernaculum. It's where they hibernate. So, for instance, in Manitoba, that's pretty far north. They have cold winters. There's one hibernaculum there where there's literally hundreds of thousands of garter snakes, and it's become a tourist attraction. And in the spring, it's really interesting. So the male garter snakes come out of the hibernaculum first, and they wait at the entrance there, and then the females come out later, and they try to chase them to mate. But we actually have hibernaculum in the Rouge, and usually sometimes on a southern slope, the snakes will start coming out even maybe the 3rd week of April, 1st week of May, and they do hibernate. They usually go deep down, 3 or 4 feet down, where it doesn't really freeze solid, so they're below the frost line, and they gather up by the hundreds sometimes, again, sharing body heat, just like the flying squirrels or the meadow voles.
I'm so glad you mentioned Manitoba. I was going to if you didn't, so I'd encourage all our classes when you're done, look up the Narcissus snake dens. It might be your waking nightmare. For me, it's just absolutely glorious, but no matter what, it's an incredible image of wildlife. It's one of the coolest things you can do in all of Canada in terms of nature exploration and discovery. So do check out those snake dens when you're done. Miss Woodley's class, let's wrap it up. Come on in and go for it with one last question.
Okay, thank you. This was so entertaining. Before we came onto our virtual field trip today, we did look into the gray tree frog a little bit because we hadn't really known, not everybody in my class knew about that species of amphibian.
Oh, I think you cut out, Miss Woodley. We'll never know what the question is. Miss Woodley, okay, so we're going to see if you can come back in a minute. Hopefully that connection comes back and we're good to go. You can also type to me in the chat bar if you want to share that question. While we're waiting for that question, instead of doing a wrap-up at the end, I'll do it before Miss Woodley's question. I'd encourage all our groups tuning in today. Check out friendsoftherouge.ca. You can find out all sorts of amazing information about what they do there, those hikes, tree planting, and more in season, as well as find out a lot of really great information. If you're in Southern Ontario, the Biodiversity in the City series, it's a Toronto nature series, but it applies to a lot of Southern Ontario, is just an incredible series of books you can get at a lot of public libraries to highlight the wildlife that lives near us. And again, you might as well check out the snake dens while you're at it. So with that, I think Miss Woodley's back good to go. Let's see. Miss Woodley, take two. Kind of, sort of. So it's not working for poor Miss Woodley. Well, what we'll do then is, Miss Woodley, if you want to share that question with me afterwards, I'll make sure that Jim and Tivia get it. Thank you so much for joining in, everyone. And what I want to say again is thank you to the over 400 kids tuning in from across North America for joining us today. Really, really appreciate you all being here. Jim and Tivia, is there any last message you want to share with us before we wrap up for the day?
Perhaps I could. The gray tree frog is the logo that Friends of the Rouge chose it. And the reason we chose it is because it lives up in the trees in the summertime, and it has to come down and cross the land and go into the water. So it integrates the air, land, and water. And they could change colors. They have little cells that change from green to gray to black. And they're just amazing creatures. Because they rely on camouflage, they don't really jump away from you so much. And if you're lucky enough and you don't have sunscreen or chemicals on your hand, they will sit just gently on your hand. They're very gentle and beautiful creatures. The gray tree frog. They can also be emerald green, gray and black, or any mixture in between.
Very, very cool. Well, thank you guys so much for another amazing presentation. For anyone keen, check out our YouTube channel for more from Friends of the Rouge Watershed. They've done a whole series of awesome talks with us. And as you guys know, what we do at the end of every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our teachers with their connections working. So Mr. Dunn, Ms. Gerdari, and Ms. Salinas, if you guys want to join me in saying a big thank you. And